Right, it's time we crack on with the tier list for the Division 2 named weapons. And just to get this started, I'm going to try and do, well, I am doing this video in a slightly different manner to how I normally do them. I used to do them like pre-recorded, then I started doing like live recording and editing. Now I'm trying to do like a mix of the two, so this is just me experimenting, and hopefully if it works, it should be slightly better quality while still getting my face on screen, because a lot of you have said that you prefer it. Seems a bit more personal because I'm talking to you, and strangely, there's a lot of deaf people that watch my videos, and they are so much more enjoying me with the face on screen just because they're able to lip read and put subtitles on. So I feel it's a bit more inclusive. Anyway, with the tier listing, I'm going to be doing the standard S, best, A, B, C, D, and then F for get out. However, I'm also adding in 2 extras, and that's going to be M for meta. So there are like a few named items which are like considered to be like the meta, so that's obviously going to be there. And then I'm going to have an X as well, nice big X, which basically means I wouldn't even bother. The weapon is so bad, just don't bother. So that's basically how it's going to go, and going to be doing it basically the exact same way that I did it in my previous ones. When comparing these as a tier list. So the first one is going to be a comparison of just the named items. So good example of this is going to be the first weapon on our list, which is Manic with Perfect Overflowing. If we compare this with just the other named items, Manic is a B tier, around there. Potentially could be an A depending if you are wanting the more sustained side, but then at the same time, if you're wanting more of a DPS side, it would probably go down to a C tier. So nice middle ground, put it at B. But this is just comparing it to the other named ARs. It's a pretty good weapon. However, when we then look at what Manic is able to do when we actually compare it against all of the ARs, it drops down to a D tier, which hopefully this is kind of self-explanatory, simply just because what can a Manic do that a Foamath with fast hands, strained, or optimist can't? The only thing that Manic will actually have over it then is going to be the overall magazine damage. In terms of DPS performance, accuracy, stability, a Foamath is going to win. And even then, if we include a Foamath with fast hands, it will probably win in sustained DPS as well. So that will hopefully give you like a bit of understanding of the way around I'm doing this. Anyway, hopefully on screen now, it should be that side, is the tier list for comparing them with just the named items involved. So up first, like I said, we do have Manic at B tier. Next, we have Invisible Hand with Perfect Allegro. Due to the fact that this has a 12% increase in fire rate, this does perform quite well, but it only really has a monopoly on the Orgs. It is just the best Org. Shield Splinterer, S tier, simply just because it is the F2000 is a high-class DPS weapon anyway. It's also got a DPS talent, and even including a Foamath with Optimist, the Shield Splinterer just edges it out. Burnout, A tier. It is a Foamath. The talent is pretty useless, and due to the fact that we're unable to continually proc and refresh it, we actually have to wait for the buff to end and then push it back out. It does kind of fall short just a little bit. Savage Wolverine is a very, very powerful weapon. It's like the second highest DPS weapon in the game. The problem is it is damn near impossible to keep it up 100%, or for you to actually have just a base out DPS build. You're typically going to have to add in blue cores, adrenaline rush, etc, etc. So in order to get this weapon to work, you kind of need to nerf other areas to get this weapon to actually work at high as possible. Pyromaniac, A tier. Technically speaking, this is an S tier weapon, but it only works in group, as well as someone in your group has to be running Eclipse. True that Pyromaniac with Perfect Ignited is able to self-proc to get that buff going, but you're unable to have it up 100% of the time solo. If you're going to have it up 100% of the time, you'll either have to make concessions on your build to allow you to do this, or play in a group with someone running Eclipse. So it gets an A tier. Glory Days, honestly, this is a really good weapon. I love this weapon, but I only use it just for the talent because the talent interacts with chem launchers, specifically Oxidizer. So the weapon itself, oh how the mighty have fallen, P416, may you rest in peace, used to be the meta, but I mostly use this and I mostly see this weapon only really being used for Oxys. Mechanical Animal, again, C tier. The problem with this just simply is there's not really that much call for it. It is going to be very handy, but despite the fact that it actually also houses my favourite talent, it kind of hurts me to put it here, but the SIG just isn't all that good. Test Subject is a very unique weapon in the sense of it's missing a mod slot, and it has a very powerful talent on it. So we're going to give it an A tier. Kingbreaker, S tier, simply just because when it comes to a pulse build, Heartbreaker or high end, it is probably the best weapon at maximum stack to utilize with a pulse, essentially. Rail Splitter, I've put in B tier. I will probably say that it should be in C, but I really wanted it to just be slightly higher, just because I personally feel like the talent is quite worthwhile. I'm aware a lot of people aren't going to see it this way, but it's still a very high DPS weapon. I think they're like, the CTAR's like 4/5 overall. No, I think it's 4th or 3rd. Still, it's a very high DPS weapon. The bullet for bullet damage is the lowest out of all the ARs, but it's the only other AR other than Dod-Foamath to come with 900 RPM. So it is still going to be a pretty potent weapon, regardless of whether you actually feel you're getting that increase in accuracy or not. First up on the LMGs is Dare. As you can see, it's got an X. This is going to be our first X. The reason for this is one, the GR9 is actually not that great. Get the joke, hopefully. As well as you can't even put the Link laser pointer on it from Technician. So you're forced to utilize Sharpshooter or the Scanner Pulse, which consumes a skill that you may need to use somewhere else. So it's a no from me. Then we have Tabula Rasa. Now, Tabula Rasa is an L86, which is one of the top tier LMGs. The problem is it is still an LMG. So as much as I would want this to be an S or A tier, it's an LMG. And then just adding in the simple fact of perfect steady-handed, which is great on an LMG. It works beautifully. Problem is, maximum mag of an L86 is 50, and we have to get to 75 stacks. So I would actually prefer this on another LMG. Perhaps swapping Tabula Rasa and Black Friday around. And speaking of Black Friday, Perfect Unhinged received 22% weapon damage at the cost of 25% stability and accuracy. The negatives here vastly outperform the positives, so we are going to give this a C. Then we have Good Times, which is an M60, which is, I believe, one of the fan favourites of an LMG. It's got very high damage and, well, perfect fast hands, let's face it. So the big problem with LMGs is, one, accuracy, stability, suppress, reload, and this just mitigates one of them. So, yeah, we're going to give this an A tier. The Stinger, I don't actually have the Stinger, so I can't really give it an accurate guess, which is why it's a question mark. However, I've had a lot of people say to me that it doesn't really work that well, that people that do have it, they've sent me clips of them trying to utilize it, and I'm going to have to give it a D tier, simply just because the mechanic behind it doesn't seem that worthwhile, and again, it's an LMG. Sleipnir is an S tier / B tier. If you're going to use it in the open world, it can perform quite well. It does do a lot of damage. It can slap. But its real benefit is using it against chungers, raid bosses, as well as legendary stronghold bosses. This is where this weapon really shines. So as much as it's a B tier, just running around like a lunatic with it, where you really want to use this is going to be Operation Iron Horse. A great one is Lieutenant Grey. He is a complete DPS check. open up a stinger on him, you can basically solo him while the rest of your team go for a coffee break. Now we have Big Show. Don't get me wrong, Big Show is an MG5, which is one of the better LMGs in the game. The problem is that 40% amp from shocked damage. There's no real decent sources of shock in the game outside of the shock trap, and the cooldown of that is absolutely horrible. So being able to utilize this talent as much as we would like to be able to is a no-go. Like if it was like 40% damage to foamed targets, this would be like M. This would be a meta weapon, but it's not. It's shock, which is like the least used status, regardless of how people feel about St. Elmo's. It's the least used status in the game, probably, just because there's no reliable source to manually proc it on repeat reliably. So, yeah, sorry. Carnage, I kind of feel like I've done this a bit of an injustice, but the problem simply is this weapon only really finds itself in any situation remotely viable on ongoing directive. So as much as on an ongoing directive build, I'd probably put this as an A tier. I'm trying to look at the big picture, and just because this weapon only finds itself on ongoing directive builds, I'm going to have to give it a D. This doesn't mean that ongoing directive builds with Carnage are bad. I'm just giving it like a over umbrella sort of approach. Like, how would this perform on Strikers? Poorly. L86 would do better. How would this perform on Heartbreaker? Poorly. L86 would do better. Like Tabula Rasa would do better. Hell, even in this example, Dare would do better on a Heartbreaker build than Carnage would. The only area where Carnage is useful is ongoing directive. On ongoing directive, A tier. But big picture. From here, we have New Reliable. New Reliable is brilliant simply just because of perfect optimized, increases weapon handling by 30%, solves the vast majority of the issues with LMG, despite the fact that this doesn't really have the reload issue because it is magazine reload rather than belt reload. However, it does solve the accuracy, it does solve the stability, it does give you a very quick reload as well, which just leaves the LMG-ness, the suppressed mechanic, being the only problem, and it is also one of the highest DPS LMGs in the game, which then takes us to Quiet Roar with Perfect Overwhelmed X, simply just because suppressing an enemy that is not currently suppressed grants 12% weapon damage for 12 seconds. Great. So you've suppressed all your enemies and now you've got nothing to shoot. What is the point? We're then going to move into SMGs. Up first, we have the Grudge. This is a very, very powerful SMG, and I believe it is also meta in a few scenarios within Dark Hours speedrunning. Other than that, it is still a very viable option. It's got some absolutely killer damage, and as long as you're able to proc it, it's going to require a variety of different builds, as well as the utilization of skills. But let's face it, like Heartbreaker build, add Banshee Pulse. Striker build, add Banshee Pulse. Ongoing directive, always active, essentially. There's a multitude of ways in which you're able to operate this. So we're going to give this an A. Cabaret X, exact same reasoning as Big Show. Annoyingly, it is on a better weapon, such as the MPX. I believe it's the it's the MP5 ST. It's a better weapon platform for the talent, but it still has that same problem. Swap chain, B tier. There are ways in which you're able to chain this and constantly refresh it, which is absolutely beautiful. But there are still going to be better weapons for this, which then leads us into safety distance. This is a better weapon in terms of overall performance. However, the downside to safety distance, same as swap chain, they're both B tier, but the upside to safety distance is it eliminates the negatives of an SMG, but you also get the negative of the fact that you can't constantly refresh it. The apartment, D tier. Sorry, I have to collect myself because I've just said measured as D and not an X. When we're just comparing this to other SMGs, it is the only thing that is holding this weapon in place is just the fact that it's an MPX. If it was on any other weapon minus a Vector, it would be an X immediately. The only thing holding this at D tier is just the simple fact that it is an MPX. Emmeline's Guard, we have this at C tier. Albeit this isn't actually that great, however, the FN P90 is actually a pretty decent weapons platform within this game. It's not the best, it's not the worst, it's just a very solid choice. I would like to see some more attachments for it. However, the main kicker for this is going to be it's a pretty, well, at least in my experience, it's pretty easily achievable and easy to obtain. And perfect preservation is a very good way for new players to learn. And that's basically the only reason I'm having it in C tier. Just because it is a very new player friendly weapon. Not a lot going on, 21% crit chance. Haven't got to worry about mods. You can just whack it on a build, start shooting stuff, and have fun. From here, we have Slayer. Obviously, this is an X. Like, I don't think I need to explain why Slayer is a no-go. After which, we have Cold Relations, named PP19 with Perfectly Strained, and that is literally the only reason this is B tier. PP19 is a very bad weapon. Perfectly Strained is a very good talent. The only reason this is holding on to anything is just the talent. So I'm going to give it a B tier. After which we have Dark Winter. This is S tier. Theoretically, this should be meta. But to be perfectly honest, Killer kind of does break the boundary on this a little bit. Although Perfect Killer is a better option than just normal Killer, simply because of that 10% increase in critical hit damage, along with it being on an SMG, which has 21% crit chance on it. You're already at a pretty decent area in order to continually proc this. Problem is, it's still RNG. Although theoretically, Dark Winter is the best SMG in the game at the moment. Hurry up, Ouroboros, hurry up. It's still RNG, which is going to be its big downfall. Now we're going to move into shotguns, and first on the list is good old rock and roll. Despite my rant about this in a previous video, a lot of people seem to think that I don't like rock and roll. This is completely untrue. It is still an A tier weapon, high DPS, high sustain, good overall magazine damage, brilliant for stacking. It fits into a lot of builds very, very well. It's still an A tier weapon. I just personally feel Pummel is better. That's literally it. Lefty. Again, this is an ACS 12, but the problem is we're not going to really be getting any benefit out of the talent. So I'm going to drop this down to a B tier, simply because we can utilise the talent, but it's still an ACS 12. After that, we have Boomstick. Now, the great thing about Boomstick and why this is an A tier is simply just because as long as you're firing, you're getting the buff. It kind of, like mechanically, kind of similar to like Optimist, you don't have to worry about it. You just fire. On reload, you get an increase in damage. Stacks up to 5 times. Problem solved. 25% more damage. Firestarter. I am giving this an S tier simply because a double barrel shotgun, although it's the sawn-off version, is still going to be very powerful. It's still going to do a lot of damage. Then adding in the fact of, I would argue it's basically a necessity on a lot of Eclipse builds, or even just a debuff build if someone else is playing Eclipse. So I am going to give this an S tier, especially just because we're comparing it against other named items. Don't worry, it does fall off before people start complaining. Send off. A tier. Although it's not going to be the best shotgun, the KSG is technically the worst shotgun in the game. The only thing it really has going for it is the overall magazine damage, but the problem I see with that is if you're requiring an entire magazine of a shotgun to kill something, you might want to relook at your build. If you're going to go for Pummel in terms of DPS, Super 90. If you're going to go for headshots in terms of overall damage, we have the M870. The only thing this really has going for it is an increase in optimal range, which is very nice on a shotgun, but also not really required. We're playing a shotgun. Come on. If you're playing a shotgun, you should be thinking close range. After which we have the, I'm not going to pronounce this, the named M870 with perfect jazz hands. S tier. Just because of how much damage it does. Admittedly, yes, having a Pummel M870 would be better. Why increase the reload speed when we can just negate it altogether? However, we're not always in a situation of where we're able to continually proc Pummel. So in those situations, having that increase in reload speed is going to be very, very powerful. Now we have Tsunami, perfect Pummel, A tier. Although it's not the best shotgun in the game, being able to more reliably proc pummel is going to help it out a lot, and in terms of overall performance, it's one of the best named items in the game, and it's also one of my favorite shotguns. So yeah, I mean, in terms of DPS, simply just because of how we're able to continually proc pummel, it can actually in some ways keep up with a Super 90 with pummel, just because it requires one less kill. And to be honest, if you're playing with like a Hunter's Fury build, the damage isn't going to be a problem anyway, so you're going to be able to just absolutely spam those shots. And if you do need to reload, it's a magazine reload rather than individual shells, so your characters will sit there going which is a nice touch. Backup boomstick, I'm going to give an A tier. I don't really ever see this be used. However, technically speaking, shot for shot, it's the most powerful shotgun in the game. It is kind of funny. Downside being very small magazine. After which we have Enforcer, D tier. Now I'm going to get a lot of flack for this, and I know a lot of people are going to complain. However, from a mathematical standpoint, Enforcer is the worst shotgun in the game. Like, bar none. Simply just because it is missing an entire attribute. We are missing 12% damage to targets out of cover, or 10% damage to health, whatever it is. We are missing so much in the way of damage because of this. Even with perfect pummel, the Enforcer is unable, with pummel active, it's unable to keep up with just a Super 90 without pummel active. That should tell you the difference in this weapon. It is pretty damn terrible. So, D tier. The Mop, C tier. Now, I had a bit of a lengthy debate with a lot of people, and the overall utility of this weapon is brilliant, especially if you can get one and put preservation on it as well. 1 kill, 20% armor, well, 22% armor. No, 20% armor. And then, if you're able to get a headshot kill, that's 30% armor on kill. This is nothing to scoff at. My issue is it's armor on kill. You need to get the kill to get this. So for me, it's not really that worth it when I can go for a higher damage option with preservation on. And in this regard, depending on your build, you might get better options or usability out of Emmeline's Guard with perfect preservation. That extra 4% is going to be, depending on your build, nothing really to scoff at. If you're playing a full red build, the extra 4% is really going to help you out. If you're not playing a red build, you're not going to notice that 4%. Now we move into rifles. Up first, we have the Virginian. This was actually a lengthy debate, simply just because, especially within the meta crowd, the Virginian or the 1886 as a whole has two very polarized opposites. You've got one group that absolutely love this weapon, especially with riflemen or determined, fine. And then you've got another group that are just like, why would you do this? M1A all the way, who hurt you? I'm very much in the middle. I quite like the weapon. It was one of the first weapons I actually used when actually pushing into the end game, specifically the Virginian. And it really did actually help me out. There was a very specific build that I used to increase my accuracy, my positioning, my overall game sense, which hopefully maybe I'll share with you guys one day. So because of this, I do feel like the Virginian is a very solid upper tier weapon. I don't think it's the meta, but it is definitely an upper tier weapon. So I'm going to give it a B tier. Now I need to pinch myself. Baker's dozen. The talent is awful. It is absolutely shocking. It rewards bad play and punishes good play. However, it is on an M1A, so while you are learning and just in the context of comparing it to the other named items, simply for the fact that it is an M1A, I'm kind of forced to put this at A tier, but that is like literally that is it, and we're going to get a very different story when we compare it to other weapons with the end meta list. After that, stage left. Again, the only thing really carrying this is an M1A. It's a SOCOM M1A, which has a little bit less damage, but it has the same fire rate as an M1A CQB. The kicker to this is it is technically the highest DPS rifle, while Sledgehammer is procced. But that is it. Weird caveat, or weird side note, I should say. For some very strange reason, this has higher RPM than other SOCOM M1As. I'm not sure why. It's like it's got a tiny little extra buff simply because it's named. Now we have the Surge. D tier. 1, I very rarely see people run Perfect Spike, because if you're going to be running a headshot build, run a headshot build. If you're going to run a skill build, run a skill build. So yeah, this kind of does end up in a bit of a weird situation. Everlasting Gaze is a bit of a strange one, simply just because it is very powerful on select few builds. However, those builds are obviously few and far between. Then comes in the utilization of this actual talent, which just kind of perpetuates the whole use of it on a very select few builds. The MK17 also isn't actually technically one of the better rifles. It's actually a pretty piss poor rifle. Adding in poor talent, or well, not a poor talent, it's a very good talent, but it's a very niche, limited talent. So what we end up with is D tier. Sorry. Harmony. Despite the fact that this also has perfectly in sync, the same as the test subject, the Resolute MK47 is not a particularly good rifle. So the only reason you're going to be using this is just to swap to it, proc perfect in sync, and then swap to something else. So it really does fall short. Artist Tool. Despite the fact that Rifleman is one of the best meta rifle talents in the game, it's on a 6716, which requires so much handling to become usable. And despite the fact that this actually can kind of keep up with M1A, classic M1A DPS, it falls short for the simple fact of, in order to actually keep up with it, you need to be spamming this thing at maximum RPM. Good luck hitting anything. After this, we go into White Death, and this is our first M, simply just because White Death is a meta weapon. It is one of the top tier marksman rifles in the game, and for very obvious reasons. Next up, we have O'Carroll. Now, this is quite interesting. Now, O'Carroll I've given A tier, simply just because it is also an M44 and it also has very high headshot damage. The reason it's not meta, the same as White Death, is simply just because on a White Death we can pick and choose our talent, assuming we get a good one, or we have variety in talent. O'Carroll we don't. We have the sparkly twinkly lights when we get a headshot at night time. So still a very good marksman rifle, but it's just not going to be meta simply because we can't pick the talent. It's a little bit less customizable. After that, we have Ekim's long stick, C tier. M70 has absolutely fallen from grace since the introduction of the M44 as well as White Death, and Perfect Ranger is nowhere near as powerful as a lot of people seem to think. So yeah, getting C. Darkness, this is a MK20 SSR. Perfect Eyeless, I personally really like the talent. It's quite fun to use, but we have no real reliable sources of blinding enemies outside of the Blinder Firefly. I would like to see a set that, I don't know, like every 25% of our armor depletes, we flashbang and blind all enemies within like a 20-meter radius for X duration of time and whatnot. I kind of feel like it would be an interesting run-around CC DPS setup, but yeah, the talent with the MMR just doesn't really work too well. Designated Hitter with Perfect Reformation. I feel like this is a bit of a weird one. The SR1's a pretty good MMR, but then just, you're going for headshots. What do I care about repair skill for? Like, if everything's dead, why do I need to repair? Pinprick, SRS, Perfect First Blood. If scoped, your first 2 shots fired from out of cover are fully or after fully reloading from empty, apply headshot damage to basically wherever you hit, and you must be using an 8x scope or higher. I feel like if we didn't have Headhunter, this would be really good. And I also feel like it would be a lot better if there was some form of stealth mechanic in the game. I genuinely feel like this is killed by the game's internal mechanic, which is also the same reason as to why Commando with Perfectly Naked is also not recommended. I've actually put an X by it, simply just because enemies without armor aren't really that much of a threat. So why do I get a bonus to headshot damage to enemies without armor? Should be enemies with armor, and then at least that way it might not be an X, and it might join Pinprick, Designated Hitter, and Darkness in D tier. And then we have Relic. Why does this thing exist? It's a headshot weapon, but it doesn't have enough damage to utilize headshot, so you're forced to use it as a DPS, but its accuracy and stability is absolutely freaking terrible, so you can't utilize it as a DPS, and then its talent also requires headshot kills. So, what? Makes no sense. This weapon just shouldn't exist. Scalpel. I've put this as an A tier, simply just because out of all of the bolt action rifles that are quite slow but typically tend to be more powerful, Scalpel has the highest DPS, and then adding in what I would feel is one of the best talents to utilize on an MMR, Future Perfect, it's actually pretty damn powerful. Now the main reason I would suggest Future Perfect is simply just because Achilles Pulse. If you're able to utilize your Achilles Pulse effectively while racking up a good amount of kills, Future Perfect allows you to do some absolutely nutty damage with an MMR self-procking. That's literally it. And then on to pistols. Now, annoyingly, a lot of pistols, it's kind of hard to grade these because some of them are sort of a bonus to your build, and others can be used as the build. For example, Orbit. Say 5.86 Magnum. These are very powerful pistols, very high burst DPS pistols. Problem is, in order to utilize the talent, we actually have to use it as an ancillary to the build. We have to get a kill with the pistol to get the buff from the weapon. However, despite the fact that this pistol is 1, very powerful, 2, that buff from the weapon can actually outperform Coyotes. So for this, I am going to give it an A tier. Then we have the Mozambique. Perfect breadbasket. It's not a very particularly good talent, breadbasket, though I personally quite enjoy it, especially on something like a Carbine 7. Completely forgot there. The problem is, I can't really see this being very worthwhile on a pistol, despite the fact that the M45A1 pistol is actually one of the upper DPS pistols in the game. After this, we have Lightning Rod. This is a kind of a weird one for me. I'm going to have to give it a B tier because it is a PF45, which again is a very high DPS weapon. It actually can outperform a lot of ARs, just the pistol, which is quite funny. But the Perfect Salvage, and I made a mistake in this in a previous video, asking or mentioning as to whether the ammo refill comes from the magical void where like Pummel does, like it doesn't consume ammo, it just refills, or whether it would actually refill from your supply. Problem is, as a lot of people pointed out, pistols have infinite ammo anyway, so why do we care? After this, we have the TDI card custom, which is our second meta weapon. And the main reason this is meta is simply just because if you're not using an exotic pistol, this is the pistol that a lot of endgame players will recommend you use simply because of that skill tier. It is amazing how often or how much that skill tier on the pistol can come in handy, especially if you're going to be utilizing skills to heal. It's very useful. And then finally, we have Prophet, which is D tier. Now, again, Prophet is a Police M686 Magnum. It's a very powerful pistol. The only reason it's D tier is simply just because of Perfect Determined. It's not a very useful talent on this type of pistol. It can work pretty well, but to be perfectly honest, there are going to be other options around this, especially considering at this point, Orbit is able to basically just outperform it by itself. Right, annoyingly this is only half the video, considering just the sheer amount of named items in the game. It's going to be quite long. I probably should just reevaluate how I'm doing these and just do them overall, rather than splitting them down into how do the named items compare against each other, and then how do they compare against basically every weapon in the game. But what can you do? I'm a crazy person. So, this is just going to be the end of part 1 with them being compared against themselves. I will be coming out with another one, hopefully pretty damn soon. Hopefully also you enjoyed the new style of me doing these videos. They take quite a bit longer. I've literally been at this for about 14 hours. It's unreal. Just because each time, like each individual video thing requires me to move it around and do quite a lot. So it's good for me to learn how to do things a different way. Hopefully you enjoyed it, but if not, let me know and I'll try and figure out something else to do. Simply, the only reason I'm doing it this way is because if I'm doing it all like a live recording, how I've been doing some of my videos, as soon as I make a mistake, I've got to scrap the entire thing and start again, and it just gets really frustrating. So this is a little bit of a better way to do it, and it also means I'm able to communicate a little bit more freely rather than go sort of going while playing and things going wrong. But yeah, so there will be another one coming out when I'm able to, comparing them against the meta. You'll see a lot more X's. But in the meantime, have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.